took some notes. Let's do a little bit of philosophy before we get into anything else. Basic problem solving. Step 1. I have a problem. You have to get to this step. Otherwise, you're never going to do any problem solving. That's pretty important. Next one is define the problem. This sometimes is tricky, but you have to say, okay, we have a problem, but what exactly is the problem? So in this particular case, in this particular instance, we're working on a chainsaw. I need to be able to pull the crank through the crank bearings. That's the problem. You can't just push it by hand. You have to apply some other force with some type of tools or something. So you have to say, okay, here's the problem. It won't go in by hand. How do we get it in? How do we get it in well, preferably, safely, easily, with accuracy and precision, all that stuff. Next one is, next step after defining the problem is, do I need help? You have to determine whether you can tackle it or not. Can I do this? Can I tackle this on my own? Do I need to phone a friend? Do I need to call somebody, go on an online forum, check YouTube, all that stuff, whatever it might be? Or do I just have to pay to have it done? Philosophy of life. Help comes on the help's terms. You walk into your mechanic, you say, I need help, I need an oil change. He's going to quote you a price. Those are his terms. Take it or leave it. This is real important. Life philosophy is that literally the help comes in the help's terms. You don't dictate to the help because it just doesn't work like that. Now you could say, okay, I need this type of help. Then it's somebody else's responsibility to say, yes, I can handle that, or no, I can't. And then it's also your due diligence to determine whether they're telling the truth or not. Okay, beyond that, philosophy of life type stuff, let's get to the actual particular saw itself. Top 4 things. Safe, cheap, fast, and easy. Number 1, if we're going to fix this problem, which is getting the crank into the bearings and getting the case halves sealed, preferably we want to do it safely. Before we even get into all this, safe, cheap, fast, and easy, in dentistry, we have something called standard of care. It's a countrywide standard, and it makes sure that you're getting good care across the country. There usually are lots of different ways to do things, but the outcome has to be the same, and the outcome is a particular standard. It's got to last for so many years. It's got to be done with certain criteria. In dentistry, it's called standard of care. For accounting, generally accepted accounting principles are applied to certain situations, and ultimately the way to do something is called best practice. Now, I don't know what it is in machine tool, but I kind of like the word best practice. Let's not call it standard of care, let's call it best practice. So how do we arrive at best practice for a particular procedure? So this particular procedure is pulling a crank through bearings. How do we arrive at we've done it via best practice? Now, I would argue that in dentistry there is no right way to do something. There is doing it by standard of care, and then there is ways to do things even beyond standard of care. But there's really no right way to do something because we're always, that's why they call it a practice. So if you've got no particular right way to do something, you still need to aim for standard of care, and you need to aim for best practice. So what constitutes standard of care or best practice? For machine tool, I think I like best practice the best term. I know that there's lots of different ways to arrive at what I'm doing. I've done it multiple different ways. I've seen it done multiple different ways. But I believe that we should always be striving for best practice, whatever that is. And if we find a particular way to do something, then you can either kind of languish in that or continually be innovating so that you can have it done better. And better is, a bit of a tricky definition sometimes, but let's go over what best really means. And we may not be able to hit all the criteria. I'm going to set forth a bunch of criteria here, and maybe we hit all of them, and maybe we don't. In dentistry, you don't. Most of the time, you don't hit all of your ideal criteria, no matter what you're doing. So it gets a little frustrating, but again, the aim is the same. You're always aiming towards standard of care. You're always aiming towards best practice. So, what ideally do you want to see at the end of the procedure? What we want to have done it safe, cheap, fast, and easy. We want to be safe. I don't want to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt doing this. I don't want to hurt other people. I don't want to hurt the components. Okay, so I really would like to do this at room temperature. I don't want to pinch myself. I don't want to hurt myself. I don't want to gouge myself. Don't want to lose any fingers, that type of thing. So whatever we're doing, it needs to be pretty safe. I'm also going to use a criteria under safety is, could my 6-year-old daughter do it? If my 6-year-old daughter can do something like this, I'd say it's a pretty safe procedure. How about cheap? I like cheap and easy. So we really can't get to free. No matter what we do, I don't think that we can set a criteria as this is going to be free, because I don't think we're ever going to get there. Walt shows how you can get case halves and the crank together by putting them on a wood stove. A little bit of oil, a little bit, on a wood stove. And so that's pretty cheap. It isn't free, but it's certainly pretty cheap. So let's not use free as a criteria. Let's use cheap. I want to do it inexpensively. I want to do it pretty fast. Though controlled. You don't want it rushed together. You want to be able to do it fairly quickly because you're under time constraints, maybe because you're building something, but or something is setting. If you happen to be using sealer or whatever, and it happens to be setting, and you don't want it to set fully or whatever. So you have to do it relatively quickly, but it has to be controlled. You don't want to get it stuck. So in the middle of everything, you don't want to get things stuck and have to break out other tools. Easy. The whole procedure has got to be done with basic tools. We don't need really advanced tooling to do what hopefully is a relatively simple procedure. The more simple we can make it, the odds are it's more easy and fast and safe and all that stuff. The more simple we can make it, the less involved it is, the more my daughter could be able to do it. And overall, I think that's much better. Was having a discussion with somebody about cars and oil changes, and manufacturers intentionally make things difficult so that homeowners won't do them, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, because then you're not just insulting homeowners, you're insulting the mechanics. You're making things intentionally difficult so the mechanics have a hard time. Come on, why would you do that? Why not innovate towards something that is actually easier to do, easier to maintain, and always be striving for that? That makes much more sense. We don't want to have a complex process. We don't, somebody mentioned, hey Matt, you have a lot of washers or spacers or this or that, and it's kind of difficult to follow. Okay, so let's make it a non-complex process. How about accuracy? Difference between accuracy and precision, by the way, in case anybody doesn't know, accuracy, if we use a, let's say, archery and a target, accuracy has to do with repeatability. Can you get tight groupings on the target? If you could put 10 arrows in a nice tight group, that's pretty accurate. Precision has to do with hitting the bullseye. Okay, so we have an actual center and where we're aiming, so we need it done accurately and precisely. So we need to be accuracy having to do with repeatability. We need to be able to repeat the procedure over and over again and have it be precise at the end. Ultimately, this is not a super precise thing, but it's nice to get it so the crank is centered, so that you don't have to bang on the crank one way or another to get it exactly right. to be freed up or whatever. You don't have to release tension, all that stuff. And the case halves do fit together pretty tightly. So if you're not exactly on, that might be a problem. So, okay, accuracy and precision. Smooth, not awkward. It's got to go together smoothly. I don't want some clunky thing to use to have to get multiple tools and grab all kinds of tools from different places, and you get in the middle of it and something goes wrong and you're, oh, I got to break out the hammer. No. It's got to be smooth. It's just got to go together like it was meant to be that way. Ultimately, no harm to the bearings or cases. Safe to us, safe to the stuff we're doing. You don't want to hurt the bearings. Any lateral forces on the bearings, no good. I'd like to avoid that in an entirety. This is a big one for me. I believe what constitutes best practice certainly is not banging on the bearings in an axial direction. And having to do with safe again, room temperature. If you're using sealer, then you probably don't want one part being hot and one part being cold. You want it all done at room temperature. Now, I would probably say that sealers set best at room temperature. So that's a little bit about my philosophy on where I'm going with this project. And so let's see if we can get there. And let's see if we can hit all the criteria. I think we did. I think we did. So this ultimately may not be the right way to do it, but it may be the best way that's available. And I'll let you guys judge. So first off, we make sure it fits. Okay, M10. That goes on pretty good. Holds. That's all you need. You don't need it to be tight. You don't need it to be absolutely... This does not need to be absolutely precise. It just needs to grab. This is left-hand thread, M12. Pretty good. Okay. This copper sleeve here. I'm going to show you how to make it. Just a piece of copper. Not going to hurt anything. Pretty soft. Let's do a dry run. Let's say this bearing here, this is a 6203 bearing. So you have the bearing on there, so imagine that this is stuck in the case. So your adapter goes on, sleeve comes over, now all you need is something like a scrunch or whatever just to hold it. Okay, so this just prevents everything from turning, and when you tighten the nut, it presses the copper down to press the bearing on, or it actually, and the slot here gives the whole sleeve some movement, but in actuality, it pulls the crank through the bearing. So if you imagine that this is actually on in the chassis, you can imagine the crank traveling through the bearing, if the bearing is stationary. How about the other side? So you can kind of get a feel for where the crank is not going to fully drop in. You can kind of get a feel for where it could be. And that goes on there. Now I happen to have an extra set of bearings here as a dry run, but you may or may not. That the sleeve again sits on the inner race. We only want to put pressure on the inner race. We do not want to put pressure on the outer race because we're pulling through the inner race. So you have to grab the inner race and pull through, and then there's no lateral force on the bearing ultimately. So what I'm looking for in the sleeve is make sure there's enough travel up and down, and you only have to go probably less than a centimeter there. This distance here is only less than a centimeter, so there'll be plenty of travel in the slot here. That's no problem. So I can use the same sleeve for both sides. No spacers, no nothing else. So that's it. See if she works.